Hello, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dilnoza Duturaeva from the University of York, and I will be chairing this session today. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. I'm delighted to welcome Paul Cooper today. Paul writes, produces, and hosts the Fall of Civilizations podcast, which has charted in the top 10 British podcasts and gained upwards of 100 million listens since it launched in 2019. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the BBC, The Atlantic, National Geographic, New Scientist, and Discover magazine. His first novel, River of Ink, was published in January 2016, and his second novel, All Our Broken Idols, was released in May 2020. His latest work is the non-fiction Fall of Civilizations, Stories of Greatness and Decline, the contents of which he is going to share with us today. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today, especially on such a sunny day. In 1872, the French illustrator Gustave Doré published his collection, London, A Pilgrimage, containing scenes of life in our capital during the late 19th century. London was then the center of a global empire, the largest ever seen, that ruled over a third of the world's population. But the final plate of this book was an image entitled The New Zealander. It imagines a foreigner in the distant future coming to contemplate the ruins of London, just as Europeans of the time would journey to the crumbling ruins of Athens and Rome. Strewn out before this lonely wanderer lies the cracked dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, its houses roofless, the fallen pillars of the commercial wharf overgrown with willows. By the time Doré engraved this image, the trope of the New Zealander was an old one. In 1819, Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote about a future transatlantic commentator arriving in the city when London shall be a habitation of bitterns, when Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's shall stand shapeless and nameless in ruins. It was the writer Thomas Babington Macaulay who moved this traveller to the Southern Hemisphere, imagining in 1840 a time when some traveller from New Zealand shall, in the midst of a vast solitude, take his stand on a broken arch of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's. In fact, over the next decades, this trope would become so overused that by 1865, the satirical magazine Punch had had enough. They declared that the New Zealander can no longer be suffered to impede the traffic over London Bridge, much wanted at the present time in his own country, may return when London is in ruins. Since people first encountered the ruins of past societies, they have inspired a great range of emotions. And they also provoked one overriding question: what, in the end, will become of us? My name's Paul Cooper. I'm a novelist and a researcher in literature and history. And for the past 5 years, I've been the writer, producer, and host of the Fall of Civilizations podcast. It's an audio show that shows what happened when societies of the past collapsed. And it's now available in book form. Please buy it because I have a newborn child and nappies are very expensive, it turns out. From the Sumerians to the Inca, from Carthage to the Cambodian city of Angkor, I explore what went wrong, what we can learn from these disasters, and what it felt like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world. My story really began in 2016, when, as part of the research for my second novel, I visited Iraq and was taken to the remains of one of the most opulent palaces of the former dictator, Saddam Hussein. It's a domineering site rising on this artificial hill over the town of Hilla, just south of Baghdad, on a branch of the Euphrates River. It's said that after building this palace at enormous expense, Saddam only visited it once, but that every night his cook would cook him a meal just in case he ever decided to turn up. In the 13 years since the toppling of the Saddam government, the once neat gardens are now overgrown with weeds. The cavernous space of the hall is now emptied of furniture, but you can still see the traces of finery there, even though all the people in the hall are children playing football. If you walk out onto the panoramic balcony of this main bedroom, the plains of the Euphrates Valley stretch out below you, and it's there that another ruin fills your view, the sprawling mass of broken walls and ancient architecture that shows where 2,500 years before the city of Babylon once stood. Just as Mussolini drew inspiration from the ruins of Rome, Saddam hoped that building his palace here would inspire comparisons with the ancient rulers of Mesopotamia, Sargon, Esarhaddon, and Nebuchadnezzar. During his 24 years in power, he embarked on many ill-conceived restoration projects of these ruins. And when he learned that ancient kings used to stamp their names on the bricks they used, he decided to do the same thing. So that now the ancient walls have been reconstructed with bricks that bear the slogan, "From Nebuchadnezzar to Saddam Hussein." But today, the ruins of his palace stand over the ruin of Babylon like a bad joke. The palimpsest of human history being written and rewritten, scrubbed out and started again. From this point, I became fascinated in how ruins could be used and abused by those in power, and how they could become sites of resistance, and what stories each one had to tell. The world is full of ruins. The writer Walter Benjamin, who would eventually take his own life fleeing from the Nazi advance in Europe, wrote movingly in his theses on the philosophy of history about how he envisions what he calls the angel of history. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, but a storm is blowing from paradise. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. From Rome's Colosseum to the rusting mines of northern England and the crumbling suburbs of Detroit, from the pyramids of Giza to the emptied shopfronts of our high streets, to the shattered buildings of Mariupol, Aleppo, or Gaza, each of these ruins means something different, but they have one thing in common. They're each a site of historical rupture, a place where one day the future was cancelled. As countless people have found throughout history, many of them included in the pages of my book, a ruin is a place where the mind can't stay quiet. As we walk among the fallen walls and crumbling stones of an ancient temple, a palace, or a fortress, we can't help but imagine the world as it once was, and as it might have continued to be. Our minds fill in the gaps in the stones to make them whole. We sketch in the upper floors of towers and keeps that have long since rotted away, and we hear the thud of footsteps on long vanished floorboards. A ruin is a paradox. Each one shows us the fearsome power of time, while at the same time standing in defiance of it. And in being such powerful imaginary spaces, ruins have always spurred human creativity. One Babylonian world map from the 6th century BCE, inscribed on a clay tablet, shows how ancient people conceived of their world. Divided into 4 quadrants, it includes lands of serpents, dragons, and scorpion men, the far northern regions where the sun is never seen, and a great body of water they call the Bitter River. The map also describes ruined cities watched over by the ruined gods. These ruins were thought to be places of magic, the haunts of ghosts and evil spirits, and ruins are still haunting us. This haunting finds a new expression in countless video games, books, films, and television series that depict a post-apocalyptic wasteland where the familiar modern world around us is turned into a bleak and hostile place, and the comforts of modern society are stripped away. The ruins of the past and countless imagined futures remind us that history is not a linear progression. It has always been characterized by periods of flourishing, periods of decline, and periods of wanton destruction. From the Sumerians and Assyrians to the Aztec and the Inca, these stories of loss and failure are all our stories, and they're as much a part of us as any exalted monument or grand epic. And over the course of our series, it has hardly escaped the listener's attention that many of the stories of societal collapse share common themes. Perhaps most glaringly, many of these societies collapsed because the climate or environment changed around them in ways they could not foresee or control. Many kept their populations in conditions of staggering inequality, which eroded their social fabric and reduced their ability to react to crises. Some collapsed because the interconnected systems of trade that they were a part of disintegrated. Others sowed the seeds of their own destruction with excessively cruel or aggressive treatment of their neighbors, who ultimately united to destroy them. In virtually all, the productive forces that once nurtured their growth eventually turned into liabilities, but they found themselves unable to change course. One example is the Sumerian people, who flourished in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today southern Iraq, from about 3,500 BC. The Sumerians were the first recorded people to write down the first words on clay tablets pressed out of the river mud. The dawn of the Sumerian age saw the first proto-cities coalesce into true cities like Ur and Uruk, with hierarchical social structures and sophisticated urban planning, and remarkable irrigation systems. Pictured here is the great tower of the ziggurat of Ur, the ruin of which is possibly one inspiration for the legendary Tower of Babel. But by the year 2000 BC, the sun was setting on the Sumerian age. A mysterious climate shift known as the 4.2 kilo-year event saw extremely arid conditions descend over several regions around the world, possibly spurred by variations in the sun's activity. As a result, the Sumerians and the related Akkadian culture both underwent a dramatic series of droughts. On top of that, constant irrigation of their fields with river water had allowed their culture to boom to unprecedented size. But it also meant that their soil was becoming gradually more salty with every passing year, as river water evaporated in the fields. Increasing salination of the soil saw crop yields plummet, and as the centuries wore on, the Sumerians largely abandoned the growing of more fragile wheat in favor of the more salt-resistant barley. We can see this decline in crop yields play out over the centuries, meticulously recorded in the Sumerians' administrative records, written on surviving clay tablets. Human societies have features that place them somewhere between a giant machine and an enormous biological organism. They have some systems that are planned and designed consciously, but others that adapt and evolve to match their environment. And when that environment changes too rapidly to adapt, a period of extinction might follow. This series of mega-droughts placed pressure on the agriculture of the entire region, meaning that everyone in the Eastern Mediterranean was struggling. Increasingly, these people resorted to plundering and raiding to survive. Now, scarcity of resources drove enemies into the Sumerian lands. One by one, Sumerian population centers fell to invaders. In response to this catastrophe, the Sumerians responded by doing what humans do. They wrote poetry. For each of their great lost cities, they wrote a lament. One of these, the Lament for Ur, relates with tangible anguish the horror of that time, as the city's patron goddess, Ningal, fled. In the city, the wife was abandoned, the child was abandoned, possessions were scattered about. Ningal, like a bird in fright, departed from her city. All the treasures accumulated in the land were defiled. In all the storehouses abounding in the land, fires were kindled. They broke up the good house with pickaxes. They reduced the city to ruin mounds. Its queen cried, "Alas, my city," cried, "Alas, my house. Your song has been turned into weeping before you." The theme of abandonment by a god or patron deity is a common theme throughout the poetry of collapse. But since these first laments were written down, people have also reached for references to other older literature to make sense of destruction. Through much of the first millennium BC, the city of Carthage in the Bay of Tunis, in modern Tunisia, had been the preeminent power of the Mediterranean. It was the America of the early Iron Age, commanding a sprawling network of trading posts from southern Spain to Libya. But from the 3rd century, it came into conflict with a rising rival, an aggressive new regional power that had once been little more than a wealthy city-state. This was the new citizen republic of Rome. After 3 bitter wars, in the year 146 BC, Carthage was finally destroyed by the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus. As he watched the great walled city burn, there is a mysterious moment recorded by one eyewitness, when Scipio is said to have broken out in weeping. That's because he felt a sudden moment of historical awareness, a dreadful premonition that one day the same fate might befall his own city of Rome. The historian Appian also records that he murmured some lines from Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. Scipio, beholding this city which had flourished 700 years from its foundation and had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas, now come to its end in total destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle, is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the fortune of the enemy. After meditating by himself a long time and reflecting on the rise and fall of cities, nations, and empires, as well as of individuals, upon the fate of Troy, that once proud city, upon that of the Assyrians, the Medes, and the Persians, either voluntarily or otherwise, the words of the poet escaped his lips. The day shall come in which our sacred Troy and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all. And indeed, Rome would be sacked some 5.5 centuries later, amid its own catastrophic imperial decline. Scipio reached for the poetry of the Iliad in this moment, an epic about the destruction of a great city in the Mediterranean, but the poetry of the Iliad itself may have been inspired by another period of upheaval and collapse. Recent scholarship now generally holds that before being written down around the 8th century BC, the epic was passed down as oral poetry for centuries through the period known as the Greek Dark Ages. This is a period of dissolution from which few written records have survived. This Dark Age lasted for about 400 years and followed an event known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. This was a period around the year 1200 BC that saw the near simultaneous collapse of multiple powerful civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, and the Kassites of Babylon, apparently driven by another mysterious local climate shift that caused a series of widespread droughts, disruption of supply lines, and migrations of people from the northern and western Mediterranean. One Hittite poem of this time again evokes the trope of the vanished god and seems to record a time when Telepinu, the Hittite god of agriculture and the weather, turned against mankind and left the land devastated, perhaps recording a time of hunger and privation. Off stalked Telepinu. Grain and increase and abundance he took away from field and meadow. Hillsides were bare, trees were bare and put forth no new branches. Pastures were bare, springs ran dry. A famine arose in the land. Men and gods alike were about to perish from hunger. Although it was long considered mythical, archaeology has confirmed that Troy was a real city and a grand one. located on the periphery of the Hittite Empire in the mouth of the Dardanelles in modern Turkey. And during this time, archaeology shows that it was indeed sacked, with some textual records referencing a minor conflict with the Mycenaean Greeks. This war was not particularly large or momentous, but in the time between the real event and the writing down of the epics, the entire region underwent the catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse. Over that period, these epics may have preserved in a hazy form some authentic memory of that day, capturing the feeling of apocalypse that must have washed over the entire region, the trauma of a period of warfare and destruction that seemed to dwarf all others. In this way, we can trace the story of humanity back through the ages, from one collapse to another, an unbroken chain of failed societies that takes us right back to the dawn of history. So this might leave you asking, what will become of our world? Of course, it's not possible to make confident pronouncements about the future, and history has always made fools of those who try. We know that in the context of deep time, extinction-level events like supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts are an eventual certainty, but fingers crossed the odds stand against either occurring anytime soon. Science fiction authors evoke the threats of nuclear war, super pandemics, rogue artificial intelligence, even alien invasion. Some of these scenarios are plausible, some less so. But the challenges of the next century will be utterly defined by one threat that I'm sure we're all aware of, and that is global warming. The modern industrialized world has brought marvels, but it's also changing our planet in alarming and extremely rapid ways. And we're fast heading towards, or have already passed, several tipping points that mean we've largely lost control of the process of global warming already. One of these tipping points is the melting of the Arctic sea ice, which currently reflects up to 80% of the light that falls on it back into space, thus cooling the planet. We've now seen multiple years when the Arctic has seen temperatures 20 degrees higher than average, with record low ice levels. And the sea is projected to have its first ice-free summer as early as the 2030s. With its reflective power gone, the energy of the sunlight will be absorbed by the sea instead. The feedback effect of all global ice and snow loss has been calculated to add 50% to the global warming effect, thus more or less locking it in for the foreseeable future. A further 8 of these tipping points have been identified and may already be underway. We're not far from the moment when the feedbacks will themselves be driving the change, says Peter Wadhams, the climate scientist. This means that even if all global carbon emissions stopped overnight, Earth would continue to warm into the late 21st century. But of course, we are continuing to put carbon into our atmosphere at record levels. Other than a 5% drop during the COVID pandemic, global carbon emissions have grown every year and continue to grow. Many fossil fuel-producing countries are actually expanding their industries, a move that the author of one UN report has called insanity. There's no sense in becoming excessively gloomy on this subject. I don't want to depress you all on this lovely sunny day. And I don't need to list off all the ways that we're passing into a very dangerous era for our planet. The effects of the planet catching up to the carbon we've already emitted combined to create what one UN body has called a dangerous tendency for the world to move towards a global collapse scenario. It's possible that our technological ingenuity will save us, as it has before. It was once feared that the Earth's population would exceed the planet's ability to provide food in the 20th century. But the so-called green revolution in agricultural technology, such as synthetic fertilizers, saw food production continue to outpace population growth, thus averting disaster. It's not inconceivable that a new revolution in energy production or in some kind of moonshot technology like orbital mirrors or or anything like that might save us. Who knows? What we need to accept is that these changes are on their way, and their effect on our societies will be profound. As we've seen throughout our series and in my book, the collapse of a society is rarely simple. Climate collapse is likely to be an extended process that starts small and plays out over the course of a century or more, and it will likely happen unevenly around the globe. In a coup for Thomas Babington Macaulay, one study rated New Zealand as the best place on Earth to survive a global collapse, followed by other wealthy island nations, Iceland, the UK, Tasmania, and Ireland. In other places, walls are already being built between the wealthy world of the former colonial empires and the parts of the world likely to suffer the most from climate change. From the West Bank and Gaza to the US southern border, to the Australian coastal defences and the EU's eastern and Mediterranean fronts, the Migration Policy Institute writes that no continent has been spared from the reinforcement and fortification of borders, which has come to define the beginning of the 21st century. Most border walls in the world were constructed in the last 2 decades. European parliamentary researchers estimate that 1.2 billion people could be displaced globally by 2050, and climate effects have been implicated as contributory causes in wars from Syria to Libya. To put a dark spin on William Gibson's famous quote, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." Like the people of the Bronze Age or the cities of the Sumerians, the interconnected nature of our global economies means that a crisis in one part of the world is soon felt all around it. We in the West produce our textiles in Bangladesh, our semiconductors in Taiwan, our phones and computers in China, all of it transported through trade bottlenecks like the Red Sea and Panama Canal. We don't have the luxury of building our walls and cowering behind them, or of disappearing into denial or its cousin, despair. As the climate activist Rupert Read writes, it's not a matter of abandoning hope, but changing it. In abandoning hope that one way of life may continue, we open up a space for alternative hopes. What then does the future hold for our world if we are unable to avert this disaster? Here, we have to wander into the realm of science fiction, and I hope you will indulge me in this wander through the imagination. As we've seen throughout my series, humans have an immense resilience, and so long as the planet's climate eventually stabilizes, humanity will not go extinct. Wherever we see social collapse, it's followed by rebuilding, like the green shoots that burst through the ash of a forest fire. And there are things to be thankful for. In many ways, the lives of the people who come after industrial society may be better than the peoples who came before it. For one thing, smallpox has already been eradicated and cannot return to the earth. And other diseases like leprosy have been cleared from much of the world. Our descendants will hopefully still understand germ theory, know to boil drinking water, and vaccinate against disease. Unlike our ancient ancestors, their crops will be descended from our highly cultivated modern variants, and their livestock from high-yield modern breeds. Most of the easily reachable iron, copper, and tin has already been mined. And so the people of the coming centuries will likely need to extract these materials from the only place they can be found, that is, the ruins of the great cities of the fallen world. In my 6th chapter, I discuss how the people of post-Roman Britain survived by scavenging in the ruins of the abandoned Romanized cities, searching for iron and other materials that were no longer being produced. In a similar way, people of the future may clamber through the leaning, unstable skyscrapers of our once glittering financial districts, the streets now turned into forests, hung with vines and creepers. They'll strip these cities of the metal anywhere they find it, so that the scrap can be melted down and beaten into knives, hammers, weapons, and other objects. In coastal cities, they may paddle between the inundated buildings in canoes, and perhaps they'll wonder at the strange markings painted on the cracked roads they now sail over, and on the crumpled signs that rise out of the water. How will they remember us? Like the delicate paper that the Carthaginians wrote on, the palm leaf books of the Khmer, or the quipu rope knots of the Inca, our digital world will leave few footprints. Virtually all of our writing exists only in the context of the continuance of electricity, servers, and computer screens. New solid-state drives may last a long time, but whether anyone is able to read them is another matter. And our books will not last long unless they are copied down. Future people may end up knowing less about us than about the Sumerians and Assyrians, who had the good sense to write things down on clay, or the Maya and Khmer, who wrote on stone. Perhaps, like the ancient Greeks who wandered through the ruins of Mycenae, or the Britons wandering among the Roman ruins, they will invent stories of a race of giants who built those towering blocks of concrete and steel, feats now incomprehensible. Perhaps like the Medes who lived around the ruins of Nineveh, or the Hebrew poets who saw ruins like the ziggurat of Ur, they will invent stories of a people who had angered the gods with their pride and had a terrible judgment brought down upon them. Perhaps, like many ancient peoples, they will tell tales of a great flood that drowned the whole world and brought about the birth of a new one. With virtually all of the easily available fossil fuels burned, the world would likely not be able to restart the Industrial Revolution, at least in the same way as before. After an unknown number of years, perhaps thousands, perhaps only hundreds, they might rebuild and achieve levels of sophistication and technological advancement comparable to the 18th century. If electricity is invented again, it will need to be powered by wind and water rather than the easier burning of coal. And we can fancifully imagine a gradual technological revolution similar to our own occurring, but this time built on renewable power. Their world would not be an economy of extraction and exploitation, but one of reusing and repurposing. While we have attempted to back-engineer sustainability into our fossil fuel-based economy in a desperate attempt to avert disaster, their sustainability will be born out of necessity, born from the beginning in the DNA of their economies, and perhaps also in their mentalities. This far distant world, perhaps thousands of years in our future, will have risen out of so much death and suffering, but it will be a world that might finally have some hope of lasting. We will not live to see it, but there are people who will, and one day, perhaps one of them will tell our story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for this fascinating talk. And now it's time for the Q&A session. Who would like to start and ask the first question? So then, we have one question here, so my colleagues will help you. We have 2 microphones here.
So this is a question really about your podcast.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the music that you use and how you go about discovering, recording, thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, since the beginning of my podcast, I've always wanted to create a kind of auditory texture to the listening experience. I want people to feel immersed into the period, the culture, without interruptions or disturbances, to be able to feel like they've somehow fallen back through a time portal into another era. I think music is a really important way of creating that kind of sense. I find music all over the internet. I track down artists I really like and I like to return to. But I also have some musicians who put together music for me very kindly. Throughout the COVID pandemic, I was able to, while I was producing my 11th episode on Byzantium, I was able to track down a Greek Orthodox choir in London who were really kindly willing to record these amazing magisterial hymns from the Greek Orthodox tradition, some of which date back to the Byzantine era, which was a really magical thing to put in the episode. I've also been able to produce music using Andean pan flutes and this kind of thing when talking about the Inca. For me, it's one of my favorite parts of the whole project.
Thank you for your talk, and thank you particularly for quoting Rupert Read, who I think has great advice for us now. As we approach the end of this civilization, I wonder what advice you would give it in terms of preparing not for despair, but for a transition into a future that is hopefully more just and more sustainable.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and obviously not a very simple one. I think the one piece of advice I always come back to is that individualism won't save us. That there's a very popular image of what happens when the apocalypse arrives. It's Cormac McCarthy's The Road. It's the lone traveller with the shotgun wandering through the deserted landscape, who's stockpiled all the water and food and keeps it for himself. But when we actually engage with crisis literature, when we look at how people get through difficult times, it's by building community, it's by coming together. So I would say, think about if things got really bad in your community, who you know that you could reach out to, who you could speak to, trust, who could look after you in a difficult time. Do you have that network around you? And if you don't, it could be a really good life advice to build it.
Hi. Thank you again for the talk and the great podcast. I was wondering where you stand on the historiographical debate over whether we should think about decline and fall or transformation. Yeah,
I mean, it's both camps are always have points on this. So you can over-sensationalize stories of collapse, certainly, and try to paint each one as a kind of apocalypse. I try to steer clear of that kind of absolutism. But I sometimes worry that historians, if you let them have their way, would basically have you believing that nothing ever happened in history, that everything was just a kind of sequence of smooth transitions from the previous period to the next period. And I sometimes wonder about if future historians will argue that something like the Second World War was actually not that dramatic. Actually, it was just a kind of seamless transition from the pre-war period to the post-war period. Both these camps have their kind of slightly easily parodyable extremes, but you have to chart a course somewhere between them. There often is more continuity than not in a societal collapse.
Some people argue that it's just all one world war.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly one view as well.
Thank you for the talk. Would you be able to share an example of, after a fall of civilization, a particular civilization could be a hope for us in the whole rebuilding process? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I suppose we could look at our own post-Roman history. After the departure of Rome from Britain in 410, we had an extremely precipitous societal collapse. If you lived in Gaul or Spain during the end of the Western Roman Empire, you would have seen a lot of violence and upheaval, but essentially you would have just been paying taxes to a different guy, every month. Your life wouldn't have changed that much. If you lived in Constantinople or Egypt, what collapse? Yeah, everything's the same. But in Britain, partly due to its unique position within the Roman Empire, partly due to its location as an island, we almost had the plug pulled out of our entire economy. Overnight, whole classes of objects stopped being manufactured. We stopped mining metal and basically subsisted on an economy of reusing. Britain stopped eating parsley and coriander because we no longer had Roman gardens. We stopped eating stew because we no longer manufactured the large pots that were necessary to cook it. Everything about British life changed overnight in a kind of Mad Max situation. But from that, we saw the gradual coalescing of what became the basis of early medieval society, the coming together of people in ever larger bands of protection, and what were essentially originally gangs coalescing into larger and larger groups until we get the earliest medieval kingdoms. I think that period of history, although it's very difficult to find any primary sources on, is a fantastic example of how things can rebuild from virtually nothing, from an almost complete collapse.
Thanks very much for that talk. You've drawn a few connections there to previous civilizations that had experienced dramatic climate events. And I wondered if there were any examples you could think of where they had attempted to offset that by taking the kind of social and economic transformations that we need today, and had any been successful?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, to some extent, one theory of societal collapse is that it itself is a kind of adaptation, right? That a society that was unable to sustain itself has to give way and change into a less complex society, a society that is maybe more atomized, more split into smaller units, less centralized. So in some sense, the collapse itself is a kind of adaptation. But you do get societies that quite consciously attempt to avert their disasters that they see coming. As I mentioned, the Sumerians had to almost completely change their diet from mainly wheat-based, about 90% wheat, 10% barley. Over the centuries, it became 90% barley, 10% wheat, because it simply grows better in the difficult agricultural conditions they were experiencing. They also developed new canal systems in order to more efficiently drain their fields. And you get a similar thing in the Cambodian city of Angkor, where they're struggling with a similar, not just drought, but droughts followed by floods, by dramatic periods of rainfall that create an extremely difficult environment to adapt your hydraulic city to. You see them constantly widening canals in order to slow down the flow of water into the city, only to be followed by a drought where they have to narrow the canal again. In this sense, they were undertaking the kind of grand, ambitious public projects that I think we need in order to build resilience to a changing climate and changing world. It's a good question, thank you.
So do you think there are multiple civilizations now? And so, in effect, could a civilization in one part of the world fall whilst in the rest of the world, or in other civilizations around the world, they could carry on as normal, or is that just not possible in this day and age?
It's a really interesting and pertinent question. And I mean, the idea of a civilization being this kind of discrete entity that exists on its own is also, somewhat suspect. And every society is, since the dawn of time, has been intermeshed with its neighbors in systems of trade and supply. And you're right that our modern industrial society, globalized society, is a society the shape of which has never existed before. So we don't actually know what it would look like if a society like that collapsed. Can it collapse? Can there be this uneven disintegration in different parts of the world? I would argue that we are currently seeing the fraying around the edges of our globalized society, that there are parts of the world like Libya that have become entirely lawless, where these ungoverned parts of the world, where we have kind of seen this absolute social disintegration. But whether we can actually see the complete coming apart of this global system really remains to be seen, and there's no easy answers for that.
Well, we're often described as a consumer society because we consume more and more, and the richer we are, the more we consume. Is there any way of getting around this? How to get people to consume less? And what we do consume to share with other people who are not so rich? Is it possible to do that?
That's a brilliant question. I think that does sound like the kind of thing, that should be done. I'm not a futurologist or an expert in sustainability, and I don't pretend to be, but I do think we need to be re-engineering recycling to every stage of our production process. We need to be wasting less. We need to be reusing more constantly, absolutely.
Thank you very much. It was really, really mind-blowing in the sense of power, politics, poetry all together throughout centuries. My question is more the rise of empires, because civilizations always go hand in hand with empires, the British Empire, and someone is interested in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, that the Hittite and Iraq and everything. So my question is really like kind of following up what's going to happen for the future of humanity. And the rise of China is just the biggest power now. You know, America, some political scientists described it as the empire of 20th century is gone, but now 21st century is going to be an Asian century, Russia, China. And that's where do you see that overlap between the rise of civilizations and empires?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's part of what has been called the imperial cycle, the rise of a society, its decline and fall and so on. With regards to China, you know, obviously they have a political system that I would politely describe as non-ideal, but you know, I do think they are now leading the world in green technology. There's more miles of high-speed rail within China than outside China. They're regreening large parts of the Gobi Desert and so on. They're engaging in the kind of grand, ambitious public works that we need to be doing as well in order to build our resilience to the coming century, and which I think we've lost the ability to envision that kind of ambitious project in this country. We can't even build a railway to Scotland.
This question might be related to the one about can civilization collapse in one part of the world and not another. But you've concentrated on the long-term environmental and material causes of civilizational collapse. But in the end, isn't the civilization collapse a cultural moment in the sense that it collapses when people think it's collapsed?
Yeah.
You know, if we all thought civilization was collapsing, it would.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, and a really nice way of putting it, I think. I think the thing I always find the most heartbreaking is the break of continuity that will lose a kind of cultural memory or sense of cultural heritage. For instance, the quipu rope knots of the Inca. The Inca had a fascinating system of record keeping that's been called a kind of proto-writing, which are these kind of amazing fans of string, essentially. And the people initiated in the art of making these string edifices were called quipu kamayaks. And they would use them kind of like an abacus, where they would tie a knot, tie another knot in a different place to represent different units and numbers. And it's even been suggested that these were used as kind of memory aids in order to recite epic poetry, history, and so on. That learned quipu kamayak could read a quipu and be able to recite a piece of poetry. But in the collapse of the Inca during the early colonial period, the knowledge of how to read these has been completely lost, and it can never be recovered. It's just completely gone. So you get that real break in cultural memory, a break in tradition, break in this kind of mental technology. I think a fall of a civilization always contains that element as well, that the people that come after are actually unable in some way to bring back what once was.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering whether you think the rise in wealth inequality is like a symptom of the fall of civilization. I was kind of thinking about what happens with the Roman Empire and sort of amassing of huge estates and things like that. And again, with sort of similarities that might be happening in our civilization now as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wait, can you wave? I've actually lost where you are. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Sorry. That's just a disembodied voice for a second. I think it's a really interesting question. I think increasing wealth inequality is always a kind of stressor. It's a red flag sign in a society that things aren't quite working efficiently in that society. I think one example is the society of Bagan in what is today Burma, where one big stress on their society was that the temple, the Buddhist Sangha, the temple administration, was essentially tax-free, that they were amassing larger and larger amounts of land in ancient Burma, but that none of that land was able to be taxed. It all became outside the economy. And this steadily weakened the government over time until it was unable to react to crises like the arrival of the Mongols. And I think we're seeing something similar in our own society, where the top 0.001%, the billionaires, they are taking money out of the economy in a way that's creating vast inefficiencies in the way our societies work. It's obviously a good sign that people are getting rich in our society, but as the obscenely super rich become ever richer, that money is not coming back into the economy. It's going to tax havens, it's going into mega yachts and so on. So yeah, I'd certainly say that's a sign of danger.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about how leadership in past and future civilizations really affects how they can either aspire to greatness or fall into decline, because through history we often hear about the great feats of Alexander or Queen Victoria or Elizabeth, about how they built up societies. And a lot of what you were talking about how our civilization is gradually crumbling, is that we now have the power as a global civilization for individuals to take responsibility to end things like world hunger, poverty, that kind of thing. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about how you think leadership, or the lack thereof, through previous civilizations has sort of caused that decline in those lessons that we should be learning from those historical examples.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and really broad question. I would say, I feel like sometimes my show is a catalogue of the world's worst leaders, the people who really drive things over the edge. And I think the characteristic they all have in common is an inability to be criticized, an inability to listen, and that they're often driven into corners where they are unable to react efficiently. I think when leaders work most effectively is when they have ambitions, when they have large, ambitious projects they're willing to pursue, but when they're also willing to delegate to people around them who actually know what they're doing. They're not constantly taking the reins themselves, leading the army into battle themselves necessarily. So I think there are lessons from that for our own leaders, that the next century is going to contain probably the greatest challenges that humanity has ever faced, and the caliber of our leaders is going to be a crucial deciding factor in whether we're able to meet those challenges or not. So far it hasn't looked good, but let's see.
Yeah, thank you very much again, Paul, for your fascinating talk and for answering so many wonderful questions from our audience members. I'm sure many of you will be keen to get hold of a copy of your book today, which is available, as you can see, to buy from our independent bookseller, Fox Lane Book. Paul will be also here signing books for anyone who wishes to have a signed copy.